Daniel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, and I may have left some out. But all of those books of the Bible, a majority of them, if not all of that book, is considered a narrative, a story. What does that tell you about God? God's a storyteller, right? And we get to the New Testament, and one of Jesus' primary ways of teaching was through what? Parables or stories, right? Absolutely. That's pretty cool when you sit and think about God, that God is a storyteller. That's how He has related a majority of what He wants us to know through inspiration. God has chosen to reveal Himself in extraordinary ways in human history, yet in the ordinary lives of human beings. And the Spirit of God has revealed these incredible and sometimes, if you're very familiar with the Bible, very bizarre moments to us through storytelling. That's why a lot of times you hear the Bible referred to as the story of God, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. Reading, interpreting, and applying narrative does require a little bit different format than observation, interpretation, and application. So it's not the same process as you go through that. It's a little bit different. But we're going to do it this evening, and we're going to go through Genesis 22. I was going to ask you, do you know what Genesis 22 is? But if you've already got a handout in front of you, it's kind of a dead giveaway, isn't it? Abraham and Isaac. Very good. All right. 10 guidelines for interpreting narratives. I meant to put this on the back of that, but I didn't. I wish I had, but I forgot to do it. So we're going to go over them just very quickly. We're not going to spend time on them. But here are some things that you need to keep in mind as you, not only if you're just reading, it's one thing, but if you want to study it and get out of it what the author is trying to really tell you, here are some guidelines. Depending on what book you read, they're all going to be fairly similar, but maybe some different things put in or maybe taken out, but they're all going to be very similar. Number one, a narrative usually does not teach or does not directly teach a doctrine, but rather it will illustrate a teaching or group of teachings. A narrative simply records what happened. It does not necessarily record what should have happened or what ought to happen. Number three, we're not always told at the end of the narrative what was good or what was bad. The story invites reflection and thoughtful pondering based on the teachings. Rarely do the Bible authors, at least in storytelling, give us any kind of moral commentary on what was right or what was wrong. They just tell the story. The things that happen in a narrative are not necessarily a positive example for us. Paul makes that very clear, right? In 1 Corinthians 10, I think even Romans 15 or 14. But it's not necessarily a positive example for us, even if the person is a positive figure. Frequently, it is just the opposite. Next, all narratives are selective and incomplete. In other words, not all the details are given. How many Bible stories have you read and said, I wish I'd have known what would happen right here, or I wish there had been a little more information or told us what may have taken place after this or something like that. So they're all selective and incomplete. Not all the details are given, but what does appear in the story is everything that the author wants us to know. A narrative is not written to answer all of our theological questions. There will be stories that you read and you'll want to know, why did this happen, or why did God do this, or what does this mean about God? Sometimes those things are just not revealed. Historical narratives are always to be interpreted by the teaching material. In other words, you're to interpret it based on what is in the story. You don't need to look outside of that. You can, but you don't necessarily need to. And a lot of times, we'll get to that after a while. Narratives may teach either explicitly or implicitly. Number 9, always remember that Jesus told us the story is about Him. You haven't finished understanding the narrative as a Christian until you see how it helps you understand and know Him and love Him better. On the road to Emmaus, Luke 24 and verse 47, it says, and Jesus opened up their eyes and started where? He says, the law and the prophets, and told them how all these things must take place. In other words, he's showing, I'm telling you, all this stuff's about me. And then last, number 10, God is always the hero of the story. When you look at David and Goliath, who's the hero? God is. God is, always. It may look like David is. He plays a big role in that, but who's the hero? God is the hero. Okay, so as we're looking at this, we're going to read it in just a minute, but here are some things to look for in a narrative. This may feel a little bit like English class or literature class, but that's all right. Number one, pay attention to the plot. All right? And then within the plot, there are different things. It depends on who's teaching it, your literature class as to what you want to look for. But you want to look for a character or characters in their setting. This is ordinary life that's taking place. Where are they at when the story begins? Maybe what are they doing? Where are they? What's going on? Things like that. And then typically you will find a call to action or a call to adventure. Something happened that causes a problem or some kind of tension in their life. And then that's going to give rise to the conflict or the crisis. This is what we call the climax of the story. It reaches a point where a decision has to be made. Something has to be done. Either the character is going to overcome the problem or the crisis, or they're going to succumb to it and give into it. So, it just goes to show sometimes what happens isn't what should have happened. What takes place in the story is not always God's will. Matter of fact, sometimes it's the opposite. Then we're going to come to a resolution. This is where the conflict or the crisis is fixed. It is resolved. And then sometimes, not all the times, you'll have a conclusion, and this is going to tie up loose ends. Maybe a blessing is given by God or by one of the patriarchs or something of that nature. But sometimes there's not a conclusion, and what happens just leads us into the next story. I think of the life of Joseph. As you break his life up and you see all these things that happened to him, there doesn't really seem to be a conclusion until when? The very end of his life, right? But as one thing happens and comes to an end, it just kind of rolls right back in to another story. And the same thing takes place. And then it goes again and again until finally you get to the end. And then you see, oh, now we understand why all these things happened to Joseph. Pay attention to the details. Bible authors do not give all the details. They give only what needs to be revealed. So it's very important that you pay attention to them. The details of the story can imply information that the story otherwise does not supply. So there may be some things and some details in there that cause you to think things or see things that are not explicitly stated in the story itself. And then you want to look for types. Types or foreshadowing. A type is defined as a figure or example of something future and more or less prophetic that you will see fulfilled in the New Testament. Sometimes, again, we call it foreshadowing. We see in Hebrews 8 and verse 5, it talks about the things in the tabernacle were a copy of the better things to come. That's that idea. They were foreshadowing something better. And then the last thing you look for is what has been labeled the big idea. Look for the big idea of the story. You might be able to look and find a lot of little lessons, but all those lessons are going to point to the big idea of the story. It is the idea or the concept that accounts for most of the information that you're going to read in the story, or that the movement of the story finally points to. It doesn't mean that the story only has one concept, but it means all those concepts and ideas in the text work together to form the big idea. And that's why that story is in the Bible. All right, let's look at Genesis 22. Genesis 22. We're going to look at verses 1 through 19. Let's read together. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, wouldn't you like to know what God's voice sounds like? And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And Isaac said, Behold, the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place of which God had told them. Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now what? Just imagine somebody that is reading this for the very first time. What are they thinking? Then Abraham reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, or Yahweh Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived in Beersheba. What a story, right? Man, you think of that, and you can, if you really get into that, think of it. Don't you feel what Abraham felt? Especially if you're a father? And can you imagine what what he felt, especially if you're a son to a father, of what's going on? An amazing story. So let's look at the plot for a minute. The characters in the setting. What's going on in verse 1? What is the setting? Doesn't give you a whole lot. Sometimes it doesn't give you much at all. But as you think about this, it says, after these things. What does that refer to? What's after these things? What's that referring to? Typically, you're going to look at the few verses preceding this. What's going on before the author says, after these things? Well, you go to the chapter 21 and you see the birth of Isaac. Well, that's not it exactly. Then God protects Hagar and Ishmael. I'm looking at the titles in my book. Well, then you come to the last section of chapter 21. You see a treaty with Abimelech. And so there's this well that's been dug, and there's a little bit of argument that's going on. And so Abraham gives Abimelech 7 ewe lambs of the flock. And Abimelech says to Abraham, verse 29, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you set apart? In verse 30, he said, These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore the place was called Beersheba, because both of them swore an oath. And so this argument's resolved, and the author just says, after these things. And it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it seems like what the author is saying is, just as life is going on as normal for Abraham, I mean, the treaty with a well, he's just resolving a conflict that's going on. He gets that settled, and then what happens? God shows up, right? Everything's just going on as normal as it would in ancient times. And then God shows up. And there is a call to action, verses 2 through 8. God asks Abraham to do probably one of the most disturbing things that you read in Scripture. I don't know about you, but I've read the story so many times that I'm very familiar with it, aren't you? And you really lose kind of the shocking factor of what's taking place here. I mean, imagine somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want you to take your son and sacrifice him. What would you do? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, we have a problem explaining God's actions here sometimes, don't we? Why would God do that? Well, yes. Yes. Yeah. Abraham he just goes along with it. God says, take your son, your only son, whom you love. It's the first time love is mentioned in the Bible. First time. Pretty interesting, isn't it? There may be a reason for that, I think. And so we'll get to that in just a minute. But you look, it's the first time that love is mentioned in the Bible, and it's Abraham's love for his son Isaac. Abraham's asked to do the unthinkable. Listen and feel the tension build here for just a second. He says, take your son. All right, God, that's okay. Where are you going to take us? This is vacation. What are we going to do? Take your son, your own. Oh, which one? Isaac. Okay, I'll take Isaac. All right. Remember, he's got Ishmael, but he says, so it makes it clear. Take your son Isaac, whom you love. You're right, God. I love him with all my heart. He's the one that you gave to me through my wife Sarah. He's the one of promise. He's the one that you've said you're going to bless all the nations of the earth through. All right. What are we going to do? Sacrifice him. Not just that. After you sacrifice him, I want him to be a burnt offering. I want you to burn him. Wow. Don't you feel the tension build there as he says, take your son? Okay, I can do that. And it ends with burn him. Offering him as a burnt offering. Without hesitation, Abraham wakes up early the next morning, makes the necessary preparations for the trip. He grabbed two of his young men and Isaac, and they started on the journey to where God was taking him. Didn't know exactly where he's going. Kind of takes our minds back to Genesis 12, where God says, Abraham, go to a country that I'll show you. Where's it at? Don't worry about it. Just travel, and I'll take you there. Yeah, that's a good point. She said, I wonder what Sarah was thinking. I wonder if, and that's part of the details that the story leaves out, right? I wonder if Abraham even told Sarah. Maybe Abraham said, hey, we're going to go worship and we'll be back later, a few days. I don't know. What do you think? Not sure I would tell my wife if that's what God asked me to do. I don't know. Yeah, that's a tough question. Then on the third day, they stop. Abraham stops the donkey, says, this is the place. Abraham tells his young men, I want y'all to stay here, and Isaac and I are going to worship, and we'll be back. Abraham says here, Isaac, carry this. Here's all the wood that we need for the sacrifice. It's like a dad, right? The dad grabs the knife and the fire. He said, here, you carry the heavy stuff. Abraham's 100 years old, right? Or more than that, really. He's probably more like 110 by this time, maybe even a little bit older. So as they hike up the mountain, Isaac notices something. What does Isaac notice? There's what? There's no sacrifice. Hey, Dad, we've got everything except I notice there's a key element missing. Every time that we have worshiped God, there's always been an animal involved. There's always been a goat or a sheep or a ram or a bull. There's always been something that we offered. Where's it at? And Abraham's response is, don't worry about it. God will take care of it. Don't worry about it. God will take care of it. The tension is building, and the next few verses speed it up. We now come to the crisis or the conflict moment, verses 9 and 10. They arrive at the place, and now a decision has to be made. Abraham builds the altar. He places the wood on the altar. And here are the details left out that I would love to know. Does he say something to Isaac? Yeah. Yeah, Isaac knows how this works. His father's a godly man. He's taught him how to offer sacrifices and how you go about these things. And so he's built the altar, put the wood on it, and now he says, maybe he doesn't. Maybe, I don't know. And so he ties up his son. He wasn't a little kid. He carried the wood all the way up the mountain. And then he picks him up and he lays him on the altar. Is Isaac fighting this? There's no conversation. I think that's done on purpose. I think the story is inviting us to have this mental conversation and conflict in our head of what would we do? What would I say if I was Abraham? What would I say if I was Isaac? What would I do if I was Isaac? Would I fight my father? Would I try to run away? Would I have faith in him as he has faith in God? You see how the story's kind of sucking you in, right? And it's inviting you to wrestle with this and what exactly is going on. And so he realizes he's the sacrifice. I imagine somebody reading this for the first time, and they're going, Abraham, no, what? Stop. Abraham, quit. Don't do it. And then the angel of the Lord comes, and you're like, oh, God intervenes. And so here we have the resolution. The angel of the Lord appears and stops Abraham in verses 11 and 12. Abraham, Abraham, don't you know the relief that Abraham felt? And Isaac. He has the knife in his hand. He's ready to bring it down and sacrifice his son. Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God. And they look, and there is a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Is that an accident? Coincidence? What would we call it? Providence. God. This is God at work. God at work. This is a provision. This is providence. And so they sacrifice this lamb in place of Isaac. Yeah.
Tears streams down him, and he's, wide-eyed. He's just heard the angel talking to Abraham. He's just seen this come out of nowhere, this ram, and he's sitting there watching this ram now be slaughtered in his place.
Yeah. Don't you see how the Spirit is just an amazing storyteller? And it's very concise, but it draws you in and causes you to ask all these questions of what's happening and why is this happening and what would I do? And it's, man, the God is a compelling storyteller. And then we come to the conclusion, 15 through 19. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from him and says, "By myself I've sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And so here we have God reaffirming His covenant with Abraham. Goes all the way back to Genesis 12, where He says, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Takes us also back to Genesis 15, where He says, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars and the sand on the seashore. And then it just kind of wraps up. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. Like, okay, let's get back to normal, back to life. And I think that's what it's saying, because Beersheba takes you all the way back to the end of chapter 21, where Abraham was living life as normal before God stepped in and said, "Here's what I want you to do." And so the storyteller just says, all right. He went back to where he was before all this happened. And life went on. Mom, you'll never guess what just happened. It's possible. Yeah. Yeah. What was Isaac and Abraham's relationship after that? That's a great question. Yeah, I'm sure he did. Or, yeah. And the Spirit leaves out the detail where Sarah says, "I'm going with y'all everywhere from now on." You know, things like that. And so, what details are in the story that just stick out, that maybe are relaying and telling something to you? Tells us, we see, it doesn't say that, but it tells us how strong Abraham's faith was. Absolutely. What else? Yeah, just regular, of a middle day, just normal things going on. God pops in and says, "Abraham, got something for you to do." Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Abraham says to the young men, "We're going to worship, and I'm coming back." No. He says, "We're going to worship, and we are coming back." Yeah. Our scripture reading said that, I'm going to paraphrase it, that Isaac was as good as dead, but Abraham had the faith that God could resurrect him. So Abraham's like, if it comes to this, and I do sacrifice him, God can bring him back from the dead. Yeah. What else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Right. That's the way the Spirit tells the story, yeah. Okay.
Anybody that will leave all their kindred, their family, at a word, God said, Abraham, pack up and leave. Abraham, I mean, anybody, I love to go. Anybody says, hey, let's go. My first question is, okay, well, great, where we going?
Mm-hmm.
Abraham didn't do that. He just packed up everything and left. He didn't have a clue where he was going.
Right, right. I would like to think so, yeah.
I'm sure he was afraid, bound to be, his child would be.
Absolutely.
But evidently he believed enough in his father that he did what his father said. And that's exactly what Abraham did.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense.
Right.
A lot of stuff that God tells us to do right now, we may not understand it. I don't understand a lot about it. But God says, here's what you do. You've got faith, you just do it.
Right, right. Any other details before I tell you the ones that I wrote down?
Mine mimics the conversation y'all just had. Mine was verse 18. It talks about, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's the key to the story, absolutely. Verse 2, your only son. How many sons did Abraham have? Well, at the time, yeah, he had more. But at the time, there were two, right? There were two, Ishmael and Isaac. And so as far as God's covenant was concerned, how many sons did he have? Just one, right? And he clarifies that and who it is, Isaac. And then he says, take him, and he says to the Mount Moriah. Where's that at? Jerusalem. Very good. 2 Chronicles 3 and verse 1 tells us that Mount Moriah is in Jerusalem, which adds an interesting twist to the story after a while. I think about verse 3. Rose early. How well do you think Abraham slept that night? Maybe that's why he's up so early, Maybe he might not have slept very well, if any at all. And so he's just kind of an anxious, nervous wreck to some extent. I mean, faith doesn't necessarily just take away anxiousness, right? I mean, you still can believe in God and still feel, your guts all in knots and things like that. And so, yeah.
Kill his son and then see what God was going to do about it. So he was imagining having to actually take his hands and kill his son.
Absolutely. We have the end of the story. We know. But Abraham was living the story at the time. And he, as far as he knew, he was going to sacrifice his son. And so maybe he didn't sleep very well. On the third day. That's interesting. Long time to think about it. There was 3 days to make a final decision, right? I would be. I'm thinking of myself. 3 days journey. Donkeys don't move fast. Long days, right? To think about, is this really what am I really going to do this? The whole time, maybe Isaac's riding beside him. What conversations they have for 3 days? Wonder how many times Abraham said, I love you, son. That's just a lot to talk about on those. Janet, you already stole this one. I and the boy will go and come again. We'll both return. Abraham had faith. Verse 12, the angel interferes. Think of the relief that Abraham and Isaac both experienced. And then verse 18, in your offspring, singular. the world will be blessed. That has a New Testament reference. Look at Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. Yes. Absolutely. Galatians 3 and verse 16, Paul writes this. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say into offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. Who's he referring to there? In other words, he's saying, in Jesus, the world is going to be blessed, because it's through your lineage that Jesus, or his lineage, that Jesus comes into the world. Is this a foreshadowing? Is this story a foreshadowing? Absolutely. Of what? The crucifixion. Say that again? Yes. Isaac was a type of Jesus. Absolutely. You see so many similarities here. This is a foreshadowing. What are the similarities that you see? Only son. 3 days. Yeah, that's right. The resurrection on the third day took 3 days to get there. But here's one thing you need to understand. A foreshadowing is not going to match up perfectly. Never does. It never does. But there are a whole lot of similarities. What else? Obedience to the Father. Absolutely. What else? Okay. Okay, so he said some scholars think Isaac may have been 30 years old. Can we know that? There's no way to know that, but that would be the year that Jesus started his ministry, right? Here's some others. Both loved by their father. First time love is mentioned in the Bible, right? Both Isaac and Jesus offered themselves willingly. Both carried the wood up the hill to their sacrifice. Jesus carries the cross. Both were sacrificed on the same hill, Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. Calvary's there in Jerusalem. Both were delivered from death on the third day. And so we know Jesus is the fulfillment. And we see verses like the Great Commission to go preach the gospel, and all the nations of the earth, I know it doesn't say it this way, but are going to be blessed. Galatians 3:16 that we just read, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the offspring. Revelation 7 and verse 9, we talk about all the nations of the earth be blessed. Revelation 7 and verse 9, we see a picture of the redeemed from all the nations of the world because of Jesus. And so now we come to the hard part. What's the big idea? What are all of these details? All these things, what do they point to? What is the purpose that this story is in the Bible? What do you think? Faith and obedience, okay. How does the author portray Abraham? Faithful, righteous. He's a man of unwavering faith. We don't see him, again, details are left out, but we don't see him question God. Not once does he falter. Does that mean that he's an unloving father? No. How do we know that? Take your son that you love. First time, love is in the Bible. He loved his son. Abraham was a man of great, great faith. So is the faith of Abraham the big idea? It's close. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, very good, very good. The purpose of the story is actually stated twice in the story. Look at verse 8. Isaac is just asked, where's the burnt offering? Abraham says, God will provide. And so he's stopped by the angel of the Lord from sacrificing Isaac, and they see a ram caught in the thicket, and he names the place. What? The Lord will provide. Absolutely. And so we see here that the big idea is God will provide for himself. He's asked something of Abraham, but he ends up providing it for himself. He doesn't allow Abraham to go through with it. And so now we make some application to us. The Lord, God, He has provided for our greatest need. 1 Timothy 1 and verse 15, the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance that Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost, Paul says. God provided for our greatest need, and that need is forgiveness or salvation, absolutely. God shows His love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, Romans 5 and verse 8. As you think of this story, Abraham, Isaac, or any of the other Israelites, I don't think they fully comprehended what took place on that day. At least not what it was foreshadowing. God would not only demand a sacrifice, not only would He dictate the sacrifice and substitute the sacrifice and be satisfied with the sacrifice, but He Himself would become the sacrifice. Not only do I think about maybe what Isaac was thinking that day, but there was someone with the Father that day watching all of this take place. Who was it? Jesus. And He knew one day, when the time is right, that's going to be me. But I wonder, as I read things like Luke 2:41 through 52, where it says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. At what point did the young Jesus, as he grew, realize, because he would have read Genesis 22 who knows how many times, at what point would he realize, that's me. I'm the substitutionary sacrifice. I am going to be the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. And so when that day drew near and he prays in the garden, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, not as I will, but as you will. He knew he was the provision. And as time even speeds forward and it came time for Jesus to experience Genesis 22, He willingly stretched out His life on the altar, except it was a cross, as the sacrifice to cover human sin completely and wholly, and to appease or satisfy divine wrath, because that time there was not a ram caught in the thicket. There was no substitute, because why? He was the substitute. For our sake He made Him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God. Romans 3, Paul writes it this way. Starting in verse 21. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. There is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Listen to this, whom God put forward, or could we say whom God provided, as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith. That propitiation means a wrath-satisfying sacrifice. God has wrath, anger towards our sin, but the sacrifice of Jesus satisfies that. God paid the wages of our sin by offering or putting forth Jesus as the appeasement to His wrath towards our sin. Because of His great love towards us, God provided for Himself. As we read through the story, did you get a feeling of, I can't believe God is doing this? I can't believe that God is asking Abraham to do this. That same unrest or that same reaction we ought to feel towards the unprompting sacrifice of Jesus. I can't believe that God did this. And He did it for me. The life of Jesus was given so that my life could be spared. Our response ought to be, we talked this morning of faith and trust. God has provided. I know that God will continue to provide. And really, it's not God will provide, it's more of God has provided everything that I need. When you go through one of the stories like this, and instead of just reading it, but really looking at it and analyzing it and asking those questions and looking for the details, the story really comes more alive. And you really have a greater appreciation of what the Spirit has revealed as it sucks you in, and you feel what Abraham felt, or you feel what Isaac felt, or maybe from a mom's point of view, you may have felt what Sarah felt, even though those details are not provided. It's a great way, a very engaging way to read and to study God's Bible. God is a storyteller. And the great thing about it is the story's not over. The Bible is complete, but the story's not over. And you and I are still living in the story. And the story, Lord willing, will continue tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Either way, it's going to continue until Jesus returns. Are you part of the story? Are you an active part of the story? Are you listening to God's call through His Word to participate in going into the world and teaching others and loving on them? Tonight, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation for any reason, maybe you need prayers of the church, maybe there's something going on in your life that you're struggling with, maybe you need some counseling or some questions answered, maybe you're ready to put your faith in Jesus through obedience to the gospel. Whatever your need is, come forward while we stand and while we sing. or is the men's Bible class at 6:30. Be there at 6:15. 6:15. Ladies' Bible class will be Wednesday morning at 9:30 in the fellowship building. And are there any other announcements? Ladies' Day, ladies' brunch. Not this coming Saturday, but the next. It's this Saturday? Okay, it's this Saturday. Scratch that. It's this Saturday, the ladies' brunch in the fellowship building. So please sign up for that. Any others?